the second semester and also to this new series of seminars. And today, it's a great pleasure to have Hillel Aviezer here. So he graduated in the clinical neuropsychology program at the Hebrew University, and he completed his PhD under the supervision of Shlomo Benting and Hans van Racine. And he did his postdoc in Princeton with Alex Todorov, and now he's here in the psychology department in the Hebrew U, and he's going to tell us about his research. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be spending the next few minutes of your time showing you all kinds of pictures of what personally fascinates me the most in my research, which is facial expression. So prepare to be bombarded by all kinds of weird and strange images. When we think about facial expressions, and you read a typical paper on facial expressions and emotional expressions, people typically like to refer to Charles Darwin, who was indeed a great researcher and scholar that also devoted lots of his time into understanding emotional expression. But the truth of the matter, there were a couple of people before Darwin, which he acknowledges in his books. One of them is Duchenne, that we see over here, practicing facial expression studies with one of his patients. Duchenne was an odd character. He was a physician who kind of went off track because his wife died, he got depressed. And what really saved his career was his fascination with what he called Faradism, basically using an electrical generator to electrify the faces of people. Well, he also did that in other muscles. And here you see a wonderful portrayal. Duchenne actually took pictures of his subjects while he was arranging their muscular faces. And this was one of the unique initial books to actually show pictures of facial expression.
Yeah, he's paid?
Well, it looks like this person is really suffering excruciating pain, but the fact of the matter is the person did not have a sense of feeling because of nerve damage. And the person actually here referred to by Duchenne as the old man, the person doesn't really feel anything of what's going on in his face. He doesn't even know what he's actually portraying. But when we look at the face, it's almost impossible not to read out this strong, prototypical characteristic face of agony, of pain, of terror. And Duchenne, a religious man, attributes this unique characteristic of the face to the Almighty. Actually very interesting. He writes, the Creator provided each human being with the instinctive ability to express its feeling by the contraction of the same muscles. So there's lots of really information going on in this very short paragraph that Duchenne tells us. First of all, he talks about each human being. Duchenne actually believes that facial expressions are unique to us, the human species. He doesn't think that facial expressions could actually be characteristic of other animals. And he also talks about the idea that it's universal, that there's some kind of language that people can talk to each other using facial expressions without saying any words. Now, Darwin, who was, as I noted, very interested in facial expressions, in The Descent of Man, Darwin thought he would dedicate a final chapter to the topic of facial expressions, but as it turned out, he gathered more and more information on the topic of emotional expressions, and he ended up with hundreds and hundreds of pages, so he just decided it's going to be a book of itself, and that's what he did. The book was called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Not a very catchy title when you think about it, but for Darwin it was very important to stress that facial expressions are not unique to humans, because man and animals. And I really recommend taking a look at this book in the library. Actually, you can see it online. Just go through it. It's a beautiful book, and there are lots of very nice pictures and sketches of emotional expressions in animals versus people. Darwin was trying to show the continuity. And as I said, he talks about the fact that really emotional expressions can be seen in other species as well. He talks about this evolutionary basis and the fact that they should be recognized universally, but there was no real good evidence for this. Darwin had an attempt to collect some data on this. In fact, he gave some of his fellow travelers these queries about expressions in which, as you can imagine, you would get this sheet of paper, you travel overseas, and then you would have to kind of have a checklist of questions that you would have to mark, and then supply the data back to Darwin, which would prove or disprove the questions of universality. So, for example, is astonishment expressed by the eyes and mouth being open wide and by the eyebrows being raised? So if you travel overseas and the answer is yes, you would check yes and give it back to Darwin, and this would be evidence. And of course, we think of this as somewhat of a naive approach to collecting cross-cultural information. There's huge demand characteristics, et cetera, et cetera. The experimenter shouldn't really know what he's expecting and just okay, that's the way it was done at that time. And perhaps because there was no real good evidence, the notion of universality didn't really seep into the psychological community. And in fact, if we look at Landis, for example, Landis was a psychologist who was interested in facial expressions and how diagnostic are facial expressions. And Landis has this very weird experiment in which he has participants come into the lab and he really abused them in every possible way while taking pictures of their faces at the time. And then afterwards, he gave another group of participants the facial expressions of the people while being abused in different kinds of situations. For example, putting your hand into a bucket and being electrocuted while you're fiddling around looking for something, having firecrackers blow up behind your chair without you expecting it, forcing people to watch porn, exposing people to classical music and poetry, and what perhaps is the top of the line, completely off the wall in his study, is having people decapitate a live rat in the lab and taking a picture of their face while they're doing this. This runs as one of the 10 most unethical experiments in psychology, and for good reason, I think. It's pretty amazing when you think of it that there were also children in his sample. God forbid, where did they end up these days? Well, they're probably dead, that's the answer. So that's Landis' study, and just out of curiosity, this is his conclusion, that you can't really know what's going on in the faces in diagnostic, the situation. People compare situations with faces. In fact, the most common expression that he came across was, any guesses? Joy. Smiling. Joy. Well, it looked like joy. People were smiling at all these horrific situations. And of course, we can think why that would be the case, but he didn't find a clear, simple relation between situation and between expression. Well, as we know, things tend to sway back and forth in research, and facial expression research is no different. Silvan Tompkins was an eccentric psychologist working also in Princeton, also in Harvard. He was a big believer in the fact that there are these basic emotions that have basic expressions, and all we need to do is go out and we'll find them universally, cross-culturally, but the study has to be done properly. And Silvan Tompkins actually had a couple of students. One of them is Carol Lazar, the other one is Paul Ekman. These people became really towering figures in studies on facial expressions. And the nice thing was he sent them independently to collect cross-cultural data on these remote, isolated populations. None of them knew that the other person was conducting the exact same study. So if you ever want to play a mean trick on your PhD students, you can have two students conduct the exact same project, and then when they come back with the suitcase with the data, tell them, by the way, both of you did the exact same project. And there was a huge fight over this. There was lots of emotion going on, but at the end, lots of emotional faces going on, but at the end they showed pretty much a similar story, which was that facial expressions convey this discrete, categorical portrayal of emotion. And this is the kind of faces Paul Ekman actually, he made a business out of studying facial expressions and studying facial expressions. This face is out of a prototypical set of expressions that Paul Ekman created, and for a mere $350, each one of you can own this set online, and all you get is a CD with a couple of facial expressions. But this became the gold standard for research in psychology. And when you look at the face, you see the fear in the face. This is the legacy of Ekman. In fact, Ekman has a TV show dedicated to his own enterprise. I'm not sure if anyone has watched Lie to Me, but Lie to Me is based on Paul Ekman, on his figure as, well, this tells the story of this police guy who walks around and he knows how to solve crimes by looking at people's emotional expressions. He reads it out of their face. He sees the truth as it's written all over our faces. So this became a very strong view that if you just look at the isolated face, there's lots of information there. It's very, very diagnostic, and really you don't need anything else but the face. You look at the face, and if you're a healthy, normal person, you'll do just well. If you're an expert, you can even know what other people are trying to conceal from you. This is the legacy of the Ekman approach on facial expressions. And because of that, really context plays a very minimal role in the works of Paul Ekman in the basic emotion view. And this should come as a surprise to anyone who deals with psychology of the human mind, because we know that context is everywhere. And yet, in the study of facial expressions, we had this bizarre situation in which talking about context with regard to facial expression, if you're telling this to Paul Ekman, it's almost an abomination, because you're implying that the face itself isn't purely diagnostic and that the signal could shift depending on what's going on around us. Well, we, in my earlier studies in my PhD, together with Shlomo Benson and Ron Chassin, we started doubting this assumption. And we said, well, actually, we don't see faces at all in real life. So right now, you're seeing a person, and I'm seeing people sitting in front of me. There's a body together with the face. So, for the sake of the scenario, imagine that it's late night and you're kind of going to your car in the parking lot and fumbling your way, looking for the keys, and all of a sudden you got this person that's approaching you. So, well, what's going on? You have a split second to decide what are you going to do, and I've heard a wide variety of answers from students. It's a good personality test to know if you've kind of the flight mode, but all you have to do really is look at the face, and you can see that there's aggression, and that there is perhaps an intent to attack. And in general, this person is in a nasty disposition. You should probably get out of his way quickly. Well, the truth of the matter is, this facial expression was taken from the Ekman set. And in the Ekman set, this is a prototypical facial expression of disgust. So this doesn't even look like it makes sense, because in this context, the face looks very aggressive. So if you really want to see the disgust of the face, you have to put the face in a disgusting context. And when you do that, and all I can say about this stimuli is that it's not a biohazard. We created this in our living room with a couple of creative materials. But the idea is, by just planting the face in a different context, all of a sudden people can be disgusted from the face. And the face doesn't look so aggressive as it looks like it's perhaps about to puke or something like that. So the face itself has different characteristics depending on the context. And I'm going to go over the idea that we were trying to figure out, well, sometimes context seems to make a strong difference, and sometimes it doesn't make a difference. And what are the underlying rules that go around this? And one of the things, we don't think this is the only thing, but one of the important things in categorizing facial expressions and miscategorizing facial expressions is the question of similarity between the faces. And similarity you can measure either by having participants rate them, and you can look at the classification errors, or you can have an SVM perform an automated classification, and SVMs also make mistakes, and you can see what kind of mistakes are made based on the image itself, based on the pixel-wise comparison between images. So if we look at disgust, which we started with, we find that disgust and anger are actually very similar to each other perceptually. If we look at disgust and sadness, there is some ambiguity, I would say, but it's nothing near disgust and anger. So they're really kind of relatives from a second degree. And if you look at disgust and fear, even though often in real life disgust and fear come together, the prototypical facial expressions of disgust and fear are very different from each other. There's a nice paper by Josh Susk in Nature Neuroscience talking about how facial expressions of fear really open up your senses to get input from the environment, whereas facial expressions of disgust kind of close off the environment in various modalities. So based on this, we said, well, maybe we can predict when these context effects will work strongly and when they won't really work very strongly. And therefore, we took facial expressions of disgust and we planted them into different emotional contexts. In this case, emotional people, usually with holding various objects. So, for example, for disgust, there is no prototypical body of disgust. You usually have to have an object, which is a disgusting object. Well, I'm going to show you quickly some images, and you can get a feel for it yourself. This actually replicates what we previously saw in the example. When you have a disgusting face on a disgusting body, you see people are pretty good at knowing if it's disgust. A minority go to anger, but really people know. And we're asking them about the face. We're not giving them any instructions about the body. And I can tell you, I don't think I have slides on this, but even if we tell people that the body's irrelevant, even if we encourage them to ignore the body, even if we tell them that we'll pay them money if they ignore the body, it doesn't really make such a big difference. People incorporate the body. When we have disgust on anger, we get really a reversal of the data. So now most categorizations are going to go to anger. And I'm showing you here in the plots either the data that go with the face or those that go with the body. There's also other responses, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to regard them as noise. Well, we also have disgust on sadness. But first, if we look at disgust on disgust, you can see there's really a very small minority of people that choose sadness. It's not a common response. But if we take disgust and we put it on this kind of awkward, but when we have this context without the face, participants are over 90% in agreement that it's sad context. There's something about the depressed person in this heartbroken pose, and we sometimes put in the context like a tombstone or a cemetery or something like that. And when people see the context alone, they're pretty sure it's sad. But when we plant a disgust face on a sad context, well, we get pretty much equal probability of having the face categorized as disgusted or as sad. Very different emotions. But when you think about it, the faces themselves, the disgust face and the sad face, they share several action units, especially activity around the mouth. And if you look, you can see that the action around the mouth is ambiguous in the sense it's not sure is the person going to burst out crying or is the person going to throw up. There's action and there's tension in the mouth area, and something is being controlled there, but it's ambiguous. It's not really clear what it is. If we look at disgust on disgust back to the same person, you can see that hardly anyone chooses fear. Okay, now we're looking at categorization according to fear. But when we put the person in a defensive context, and we ran this sometimes with body context, we ran this other times with a gun in perspective pointing, didn't really make a difference. Something doesn't work in the connection between the face and the body. It is a glitch. And in fact, this is the first time that we see that the majority of responses is going to the correct disgust face, and people aren't buying the fear context. And the reason we think is that disgust faces and fear faces are so perceptually dissimilar that the system you can't trick the system. To a certain extent, people are going to say, I can't buy it. I can't morph this face to such a distant category. And then it breaks down. When it breaks down, you get this kind of glitch, a feeling of incongruity between the face and the body.
Excuse me.
Sure.
The reason that the numbers don't add up to 100% is
because I'm only portraying the category of the body or the category of the face. There's other responses that are there, but I'm just, for the sake of simplification, I'm just showing it there. Yeah.
A note about the previous picture, it seems that if you go back further, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this body expression can also go with disgust.
Well, that's the reason that I mentioned that we ran this in a couple of versions. In one of them, we had an unambiguous gun pointing at the person.
And the results were similar?
And practically like a copy-paste. So it's not that the context isn't strong enough, it's that something about the face, if I would put here a fearful face, try to recall the face that we saw at the beginning, the Ekman fearful face. The eyes are wide open, the mouth is gaping, everything actually is the anti-face. If you think of faces and anti-faces, it's the anti-face of disgust. That's what Huston is actually claiming. There's a limit to how much you can pull it and push it. Yeah?
I would like to ask about culture and age.
Mm-hmm.
Because when the small children don't identify usually fear, don't know how to look at it. So is it culture? How is it developed? Here you say, have this data. If you would have lowered the age of the people that you would have asked, maybe other data would be different.
Well, I think that's a great question. I have to say and make one reservation before I respond to it. Also, grown-ups aren't all that great at recognizing fearful facial expression. When you think of it from an evolutionary perspective, you would say, well, fear is a very important emotion to recognize because if you're scared and I recognize that you're scared, I should probably also be scared because something scary is happening around it. We know that there's emotional fear contagion in animals. We would expect to have something very similar in people. But for, I think, reasons that are yet unclear, at least when we show the prototypical Ekman faces of the characteristic fear, many adults seem to, quote unquote, miscategorize the face and actually name it as surprise or something like that, but they don't really see the fear, the urgency of the fear in the face. The question of how children would respond to these stimuli, children in general, well, it's a process. Children develop the ability to recognize emotions at different ages. They incorporate more emotions into their repertoire. Some would argue as a function of how their language develops. There's some data to point to that. And there is some, I would say, anecdotal evidence suggesting that children don't incorporate yet the context with the face in the same way that adults do. So, and I can give you anecdotal evidence that one of the kind of context that we played with was taking an angry face and putting it together with a person who is exerting effort. So imagine someone's holding a heavy box, and you see this. So we automatically interpret that face as an effort face, with determination and effort. In fact, it could even seem positive in certain contexts. Children will often misinterpret that and say, why is the man angry? They'll completely disregard the context. So we don't really have good data on when this happens and what's the temporal characteristics of when the children start to incorporate, what kind of bodies with what faces, but for sure this is an interesting question. We just didn't get to it yet. Regarding culture, I would also say that, yeah, there are cross-cultural differences in how people treat faces versus context. And for example, in more East Asian cultures, it tends to be more of a collectivist issue, more than what the specific person is showing. So for example, there's some interesting work by Masuda showing that when you look at one central person surrounded by other people, if you're an American, you completely disregard the other people and you focus on the central person. And if you're asked what's his emotion, you'll say the emotion of the central person. Whereas if you're coming from Japan, for example, you would take into account the emotion of other people, and it somehow changes and biases your perception of the central person. So it's more a collectivist approach and less a single person expressing emotions. But we have data which isn't out yet suggesting that the same story happens with context, which means that people from Japan, for example, which is one project that we have ongoing, are more inclined to use the context into incorporating and understanding the face than Americans or Israelis, for that sake. Israelis are kind of, and I'm not sure what to classify as true, but that's as far as the cross-cultural data. So going back to here, we see that disgust faces have this decline, that we see that the same face can be recognized with different degrees of accuracy depending on the context, and all of these contexts per se have the same recognizability when shown in isolation. And this really shows that the face itself isn't being ignored, which is, I think, an important point, especially since the bodies are big and the faces are small. Maybe you would think, well, people are just disregarding the face. They aren't disregarding the face. They're interpreting the face in a different manner depending on the context. Well, we tried to get a little bit at the process, at the attentional process that's behind this effect. And we ran an eye scanning study, and the rationale was that we know that different emotional expressions are scanned differently when people view them. So for example, if you look at angry faces, we know that people tend to focus on the eye region. If you look at disgusted faces, we know that people tend to focus on the mouth and nasal regions over here. So we have these different diagnostic areas, that are scanned in the faces. This particular image isn't coming from an eye scanning study, it's coming from a study which used a technique called bubbles. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but basically you get the same pattern in both of these studies. You have these different diagnostic areas for anger and disgust. So eye scanning studies specifically have shown, again, that anger, people scan the eyes more than the mouth, but in disgust, the scanning is kind of symmetrical between the eyes and between the mouth. So what we were interested in is, well, we have these facial expressions of disgust and anger, which are sometimes perceived as angry and sometimes perceived as disgusted. So how would the patterns of eye scanning differ when we see the same face but interpreted one time as disgust and one time as anger? You had a question?
Like with anger, they know that they're looking for anger, or
well, That's a good question. All I'm saying is an objective finding. When people see faces that are angry, you tend to have more fixations. You tend to have your saccades more towards the eye region. When I put a disgusted face, people tend to look more, or the pattern is now symmetrical versus for the mouth and versus the eyes. People typically aren't aware of this fact. I think most people have little insight into where they're really looking at the face, especially when it's a matter of slight differences in the percentages of fixations. But this is a pattern that we seem to find, and this is actually replicating. So we have people, imagine, well, this is kind of an illustration, and people don't sit so close, but imagine that you're sitting in front of a screen, and you see an angry face in an angry context, and then in the next trial, you might see the same angry face in a disgusted context, and the faces look differently. We have behavioral results, but what about the eye scanning of the stimuli? So, as I said, the behavioral results show, again, we have this shift. Disgust on anger looks anger, but when it's in disgust, it looks disgusted. Angry faces with angry bodies look angry, but angry faces with disgusted bodies looks disgusted. When we look at the eye scanning, first of all, we look at the anger face and disgust face in isolation. So there's no emotional body over here. This is just a baseline to see if we indeed find the differences between anger and disgust. And the answer is that we do find the differences replicating previous studies. The more interesting question was, what happens when the faces are in context? And what we found was that when, yes, faces are systematically shaped, the scanning of the face is systematically shaped by the context in which it's embedded. Anger on anger and anger on disgust are scanned differently, more symmetrical mouth and eye over here versus a bias towards the eyes for anger on anger. Disgust on disgust actually has a very similar scanning profile to anger on disgust. But disgust on anger, and the profile now looks very much like anger on anger. So the story was that the faces are much more malleable than we would think. It's certainly more than what Ekman would have us believing, that facial expressions are these prototypical signals that are recognized irrespective of context. It's simply not the case. And as I said, I think this really shouldn't be very surprising to us, because context is everywhere. It should also be in facial expressions. This is really just an initial step trying to figure out how this works. But all of the faces that you've seen so far are these Ekman-style, prototypical posed faces. Those faces were created in a laboratory. They were created by actors standing and posing emotions to the camera. Typically, thousands of images were created, and only hundreds were used for the pilot, and then only dozens were used for the actual set. So there's lots of pre-selection, and these faces don't necessarily happen in real life. What about real-life facial expressions? So we said, okay, let's start from a very basic differentiation. Let's go to the real life, and we'll see. What about the differences between positive and negative faces? So what do we know about positive and negative? Basic theories of emotion would predict that there should be a very strong difference between positive and negative faces, and I think it's also our basic intuition. If you look at models of emotion, like the circumplex model of emotion, pleasure and displeasure are very distinct poles, and the stronger they become, the more distinct they become, the more they grow apart, and the more dissimilar they become. If you also look at roles models, reinforcement models of animals, you see that the negative and the positive are also separated into different poles. This is the standard essential part of emotion models. If you go back to Ekman, it's clear that positive and negative expressions should be very different because they have very different action units in the face. And the more strong they're expressed, the stronger they're expressed, the more distinct and the more clear they should become. And there's, in fact, some work showing that if you take Ekman faces and you intensify them using software, it kind of creates a caricature, then you get more distinct and more different facial expressions. This all makes good sense. Ekman actually has a STEP, which is called a STEP, a subtle expression training tool, which, again, I think for about $250 you can all buy if you want to train yourself on the subtle facial expression. I can't guarantee how successful it would actually make you in real life, but the idea is that we only have problems understanding positive and negative when the emotions are very subtle. When emotions are strong and intense, we should all do a very good job at differentiating them. So, we still thought there's some room for skepticism. And And there are a couple of reasons which we can go over them. As I mentioned, these are posed expressions. What about real life expressions?
Well,
Sorry, yeah?
still about real life.
Yeah.
Usually you don't have one feeling. If you see something that disgusts you, you may become anger just in half a second.
Yeah,
So I don't know if usually we can see now is only anger or only happy or
right. I think that's a good point. There is some work on mixed emotions, and I don't think anyone would argue that there can't be mixed emotions. Some would argue, certainly Ekman would argue, that we have prototypical expressions of anger, and in some situations the predominant emotion is anger, and therefore the predominant expression should be an angry face. This is what Ekman would say in defense of your question. I'm not sure people actually show Ekman faces when they're very angry. There isn't good data on this, because literally 99% of the studies are using Ekman faces to study facial expression. So people are kind of stuck in a loop.
it's a bias.
Exactly. In real life, I would expect there to be probably some kind of mixed emotion. But here I'm asking a more basic question. I'm not asking what specific emotion is. I'm just saying, is it positive or is it negative? Is it in the good or in the bad category? It's a much more broad question. We also had skepticism because people weren't necessarily looking at peak moments of intensity. And as I said, if things should be different, we should look at the peak moments. There's interesting neurobiological work. Paper in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, talking about pleasure and pain, the differences between pleasure and pain, and actually reviewing the similarities of the systems. If you look at work like fMRI work, you'll find lots of similarities in many studies between positive and negative stimuli. And I'm not saying that they're completely overlapping, that there are no differences. It's just that the amount of overlap is sometimes surprising. Certain areas of the brain that were traditionally considered to be involved in negative stimuli, take for example the amygdala, which for many years was talked about as the sphere module detecting these negative faces or stimuli, and we now know that it responds to really positive stimuli as well. So the story seems to be complex from many directions, and also in psychology, and just plain good old psychology, we know that sometimes good and bad can blur. So, well, what about facial expressions? Maybe we can find some blurring of the categories there too. So we decided to go out to the real world, and we started with tennis players. Well, when I say that we went out to the real world, I don't mean we actually went out, God forbid, to the real world, but we went to the internet, which we found to be a very good source of stimuli. Having said that, there is a caveat, because the stimuli have gone through some selection before they reached our desk. But nevertheless, we thought it's a good place to start, and I'm certainly happy to continue and run a replication of this study in Wimbledon. So, tennis is good because, first of all, we have these real-life, highly intense emotions in which we also have the bodies and we also have the faces. And we also wanted to put the bodies in this study because, as I showed you before, bodies can be very informative and very important. It's also very clear in tennis when something is positive and when something is negative. So, I spent my postdoc in Princeton, and I still have yet to figure out the rules of baseball or American football. It's mind-boggling to me, although I did watch one of the games with my son just to make him feel good, because his father never joined him to watch sports games. And I watched the commercials, which I understood the commercials. But the game itself is very complicated, and I really give up. And I didn't want something in which I'd have to debate, is this positive, is this negative? Things can be tricky when you have also group sports. And as I mentioned, this is single, so it's one person, and either something good is happening to him or something bad is happening to him. So it's really sports for dummies. And we looked for these dozens and dozens of images using a fairly neutral search, which was reacting to winning a point versus reacting to losing a point. And we got dozens and dozens of images of professional players in the most important competitions like US Open and Wimbledon, et cetera. And then we prepared the stimuli in three different conditions. Either we had the face alone, or we had the body alone, with the face kind of blurred out, or we had the entire image, the face plus body, as you would typically see it in a magazine or on the internet or something like that. Here we have some examples of the faces, the isolated face stimuli from the study. So I'm sure you've been watching some tennis games in your time, or sports in general. Feel free to kind of guess. There's nothing unique about these particular faces. There have been many other faces that are really randomly selected from a pool of nearly 200 different faces. For example, is this person winning or losing?
Lost the point.
Lost a point. Silence. There's no penalty for making a wrong mistake, and I'll tell you the responses in 1 second.
Lost.
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 One.
The upper line is lost and the lower line is win.
Oh, looking for patterns in the data. Wonderful. Okay, so it's not that simple. It's actually a combination. It's a little more complicated. And actually here you see the losing for the L and the winning.
Did you actually verify that? I mean, if you went online to look at it.
Yes, well, we had 200, and we didn't verify for every single one, but we did sample a group of faces, and we verified it by finding the actual game on YouTube, for example, and looking for the specific frame in which we found it. And in 100% of the times, we found that it was accurate. And, well, we know by the actual articles that we found online that we have the face well, it's actually a full person, as you'll see in a moment, and we have the response of, Roger Federer reacting to losing a point in the game against such and such. And there's usually lots of detail on this. So, are there a couple of makers?
It could be that the editor of the article put in a picture that they thought would look like he just lost a point, where in fact he just won one. They do that.
In theory, that could happen. But when we sampled a couple of actual cases and we tried to track them down to the particular games, the portrayals were accurate. Are there a couple of glitches like that? In all likelihood, yeah. But when we have hundreds of images, my guess is that this is something that's reflected in the face and not of some artifact. That would be my best guess. Especially because, as I'll show you later, we find similar effects that extend beyond sports and tennis. So I don't think it's different. And there we know exactly where it's coming from, exactly when it's happening. Let me just get through a couple of more slides of these kind of weird faces, and then we'll have time to have questions. Here we see the images of where the face was actually taken from. Now, in response to your question, if you look at these images, these are the exact same images that we had extracted the faces. You can see that although the face was very vague and ambiguous, now some kind of cues are starting to emerge. And these cues fit what we saw at the label under the image, I should say. So, for example, you see people here are pumping their fists, which is a very characteristic signal of people that are reacting to winning a point. Whereas people that are losing a point, I'm not saying they never do it, but it's much more rare. People that lose a point tend to have these extended hands. And this is just the way it comes out. And this fits with what we know on the images. That's why I'm saying it's unlikely that the whole thing is an artifact, because the bodies actually do tell a diagnostic story. And when you look at the faces and the bodies, this is how you would typically see the image in the journal. And here things kind of make sense when you see them, or at least they make much more sense than before. And we have some data in which we show these images to different groups of participants. And if you see the valence rating, so people have to rate, is it positive or is it negative? Is the face, or is the stimuli positive or negative? When people see the body and the face together, the full image, they're pretty good at differentiating the losing in the red from the winning in the green. So if you get positive valence and you get negative valence. When people see the body alone, there's actually no face here. But nevertheless, the categorizations are pretty much what you see over here for the body and face. So the face seems to be adding little to the story. When you have the face alone, however, this is what things look like. So now, there's really no significant difference between the winners and the losers. There's overall negative bias. We all kind of seem miserable. But there's no good differentiation between winners and between losers. Having said that, we should say that the face isn't completely non-diagnostic. Winners and losers, when we ask people about the intensity, the muscular activation of the stimuli, and people saw face and body, or just the face, people could differentiate based on intensity the losers from the winners. But if people saw the body alone didn't have enough information to differentiate the activation. And this is activation irrespective of valence. So we're telling participants, I don't care if it's positive or negative. Just tell me how much activation is there, how much action is there, how much muscular movement is there. So it seems that faces and bodies each contribute something into the story, but the faces itself aren't very diagnostic per se. Well, we also asked people. We asked participants who didn't participate in face rating tasks. We kind of told them about this experiment, like a Gedanken, hypothetical experiment. We said to them, this is what we're doing. What do you think you would do? What would you use as the most useful part of the stimuli to differentiate the valence of the winners from the losers? And most of the people say the face is the most important part, and then a minority of people say the body and face, that's 80% and 20%, and we're left with nothing for the body. So there's actually no one in our sample that will say that the body itself is diagnostic enough to differentiate the winners from the losers, which is really startling. When the body is giving so much information and it's really not getting the proper respect that it should, people aren't attributing the valence to the body. We also actually asked participants that completed the face and body task. So these are people that saw the face and body. So this is an hypothetical. They were actually exposed to the stimuli. And we say to them, well, to what extent did you rely on the face or the body? And people are kind of split. So we have at least half of the participants that are convinced that it's coming from the face, which is really remarkable, given the fact that when we show the face in isolation, we know that people are chance level. And we call this kind of illusory valence. This was the kind of name that we gave to it, because people seem to be having this illusion of valence in the face, even though they're really reading it from the body. And because they're reading it from the body, and it's automatically going into the face, we said, hey, well, we can play around with this. We can now take these faces, and we can plant them on different bodies, and the same face would look winning or losing depending on the body. And since we were already playing with Photoshop in our previous studies, this was actually a breeze for us to do. And this is the kind of stimuli that our participants saw in this experiment. So, well, you've seen, participants didn't see them one next to another, obviously, so participants just kind of had to see them one after another in a random assortment of many images. And the face surprisingly fits each one of the contexts pretty well. Or if you look at Sharapova here in one of her wonderful screens, it's hard to know if it's a victorious screen, as you see here, or if it's this, I missed the point. So is she thrilled? Is this happiness, or is this the depression of losing a point? It's not clear. And indeed, participants, the categorization of the face is completely shifted depending on the context of the body. And okay, so I want to continue to talk about other areas. Is there any particular questions you had on tennis study before I continue to another? Yeah.
Yeah, so you're looking here at two very distinct or very specific, I don't know if emotions is the word, but winning and losing. And maybe these two, if you were to just study these in the study that you in 2008, maybe these would be very close to each other, and you need the body for disambiguation. And I don't know if you can extend these results to other emotions.
I think here we were after a somewhat different question of the question that we were asking in that study over there, because here we're asking a very basic question. Can people tell if something is positive or something is negative? It's different than, it's a more broad, basic level question than asking, can you know if this person is disgusted or is he sad? Is this person fearful or is he just surprised? That's a subtle within category differentiation. Here, there's very broad questions. Is it good or bad? Did a catastrophe happen? Or did something wonderful happen? And yes, I do think that there is perceptual similarity in between the faces of both of these categories, but we find this to be counterintuitive, because the basic model tells us that these faces should be growing more and more dissimilar from more and more apart. They should have unique characteristics, and they should be less and less ambiguous the more intense they become. This is what the classic model tells in emotions of facial expressions. But I agree with you. What we're finding is actually that they seem to merge. when things become extreme, they seem to grow more close to each other in some weird way, which we don't necessarily understand. Yes?
So, is the same expression, is it consistent with the same person, same expression of for winning or losing, or does it change each time?
That is a good question. We do not have reliable data, although we have anecdotal data here and there that it seems to be consistent. We did not check this within people. We kind of grouped, roughly 100 people over here, 100 people over here, and on average, I can tell you that this is what the data look like. I'm guessing that we would find similar results within individual people, but it's an interesting question which we did not look into yet. So I don't want to just say that I know the results.
No, because if you have a history of reinforcement, if you say, I know this person, he will respond more or less like this. I don't know this person.
So one of the things that you can look at is, for example, compare people that are naive to tennis games versus people that are expert tennis viewers. I guess you could call it something like that. And some people watch sports, 6-7 hours a day. I actually had a good friend who did my postdoc with me in Princeton, who was an avid ESPN, is that the name of the channel or something like that? ESPN channel. He had he would quit his work in the office early, and then go to work at his real job, which was to sit and watch hours and hours of ESPN. And he said to me, send me over the pictures. And I gave him a random sample of like 20, 30 pictures. And he wasn't close to chance, he was literally a chance. It happened to be like 50-50. And he was walking around with this depressed face, and I said to him, you don't have to feel bad that you got it wrong, because it's the cues aren't really there to face. Having said that, I should say that there are some cues. We have a study in which we're looking at action units, and there are differences in action units between people that are winning and losing. As we saw, there's more activation when the people are winning versus when the people are losing in the face. The point is, people don't know how to use these cues. So maybe if I would train you, and we actually have a study that we're kind of trying to train people to be better at this test, maybe they'll be better, but I don't know yet. We'll have to see how the data turn out. Yes?
Another question that might be asked is about face expression is communication. Let's say they're training by themselves in a hall against the wall.
Right.
Do they make the same faces? Or it depends when it's a big, take Sharapova. I don't know if she's screaming like this when she's with herself. Maybe in other situations, but not when she's playing or training.
Well, so Alan Fridland was a great psychologist. He's still alive, and he did this very interesting study, which is very close to what you're talking about the communication, the social communication aspect of facial expression. He photographed, this was done before the time of the fancy digital cameras, he had people in a bowling alley hiding behind the pins with the camera, and he had people sitting behind the people that were behind them with another camera. So if this is the bowling alley, I'm standing over here, and I'm walking forward, and I'm bowling, and I get a strike. It's something good happened, right? You would expect me to smile, but no, people don't smile. They don't smile. When do they start to smile? When they turn around to their friends. So there's clearly a social aspect in communication of emotion. And this is actually a big debate. Fridland started out his work as a student of Paul Ekman, and then diverted from Paul Ekman and said, no, it's not about experiencing emotion, because people don't show this all the time. It has to be a social concept. And there's more work on that. But I want to continue a little bit to show you some other intense emotions, and that's pretty much going to wrap up. Do we have until 6 o'clock? Is that accurate? Good. Yeah, we should be able. This is kind of showing you pictures. So we're looking at sports, and I think sports are really important and really interesting and a great source of stimuli, but it's also a very unique category of emotional expression. There are other categories of emotional expression, real life expressions that happen with probably less posing. But for example, we have here two people that are experiencing a very strong emotion, coming from completely different, conceptually different backgrounds. The first person is a mother who just gave birth to a little baby, and the baby is resting on her. She's experiencing a very strong emotion. This is taken from a YouTube clip with lots of information posted by the actual mother. She she had an epidural for this particular birth, so there's no physical direct pain. There's certainly physical tiredness, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the facial expression that she's portraying. This person is holding, well, the face is blurred out because it's such an awful picture. This person is holding his dead son, killed after a bombing. And we have two faces that are conveying very extreme emotions, but how different really are they? How good are we at telling them apart? Here we have two women portraying very strong emotions. The first woman is crying. She's at the funeral of her husband. He was a soldier in Afghanistan. He was killed. She's holding her newborn baby, which he actually never got to see it because he was there for months and months. This is like the most extreme situation of tragedy that I can imagine. This woman, on the other hand, is from the Extreme Home Makeover TV show. And if you're not familiar with it, I'll give you a 60-second recap of what the show is about. They take people, these miserable people, that they have this rundown home, they take them out of their home, they send them to Disneyland, and then in 1 week, they bring in hundreds of people into the house. They wreck the house down to the ground. They build this big American mansion with the most snazzy appliances you can imagine, and everything looks and probably costs like $1 million. It's really, really amazing. Then they bring the people back, but the people can't see their house because there's a big bus obstructing the house, advertising some bus company, which I can't remember now, although I've seen it many, many times. And then at the highlight of the show, the people around chant and they say, "Bus driver, move that bus." And then the bus moves and the people all of a sudden are exposed to their $1 million house for the first time. And this is very characteristic of what this extreme emotion, which is obviously, well, we can argue about this, a positive emotion. This is what it looks like. When positive emotions become strong, they start to look very much like this.
Tears of joy.
Tears of joy. So it's an expression, but it's surprising when we think of it. Why is the world like that? We can think of a model in which people that are happy look very happy, and people that are sad look very sad. And yet the fact of the matter is they tend to merge in the extremes. Here's another example of people that are showing these excruciating faces. And the first example is actually a person who had a piercing. And we have dozens and dozens of people undergoing piercings, males and females, and we have the facial expression captured at the moment of the actual piercing. So we have acute pain captured in the face. On the other hand, you'll be happy to hear I won't be showing you the body of this person because this is actually taken, there's a set of facial expressions of people experiencing an orgasm. They're taking pictures of their face only and submitting it to a website called beautifulagony.com. This isn't a couple of, 2-3 weird people. We're talking thousands and thousands of people. They have hundreds of submissions and new submissions every single month. And the faces were actually analyzed for the action movements. And now we have a focus on extreme intense pleasure versus extreme intense pain. And as you can see, it's a tricky task to know what's going on. You have a collection of a variety of faces. People are very poor at knowing if it's something positive, if it's something negative. Certainly they're not sure which category it is. Just to not keep you in the dark, these are the actual categories that we have over here. And they're really representative of dozens and dozens and dozens of faces. So when we have people just rate the face itself, all the faces seem to be kind of negative. Surprisingly, the pain faces are actually getting the most positive categorization. But one of the reasons is that people tend to, there's actually a paper by Ken Prochkin of people smile during painful procedures. He wasn't using these kind of painful procedures. He was using more hospital-like procedures in which people were undergoing physical therapy, but people tend to smile. And it's not clear if it's in the social setting of the hospital, as you mentioned before, there's something social, or do people also smile on their own? My intuition is less so, probably. But still, very hard to tell the differences. And also here, I'm going to quickly browse through it. We planted these faces in different contexts. Oh, actually here, I think we have, oh, excellent. So I will have time to show this. I was afraid I'm not going to have time to show this. So we were interested in the question of, well, categorizing the face is one thing, but what if we have people just posing the faces, basically. So imagine that you see a face on the screen, and all you have to do is just mimic your face to look like the face you see on the screen. It's a little bit of an awkward test because you're seeing these very extreme faces, and you have to go about like doing or something like that. Well, there's no noise, right? Just add the noise. This is exactly what we asked participants to do, but we added a twist because we took the same faces and we planted them in positive or in negative body context as we've done with the tennis players before. So you have a camera over here, and then you have your participant who's looking one time at a face like this, and one time at a face like this. And they're seeing many, many of these images, so they really don't get the fact, they miss the fact that we're showing them the same faces in different body contexts. And our subjects are just trying to kind of mimic the face. And here we see another example of the same identical face appearing in a winning or a losing context. And what we found was when we videotaped faces and then we analyzed the faces that were videotaped. It's a little bit dark. I hope you can see it. When people were looking at winning faces on a winning body, you can actually see activation of a smile in their portrayal. This isn't one person. This is a morph of a bunch of participants overall. When people see the winning on the losing face, you start to see this activity in their face, and in both cases they're opening the mouth, but one of the mimics has a more positive valence to it, and one of the mimics has a more negative valence to it. So people are incorporating the context, and then it's going out in their output, not just of categorization. There's actually no emotion categorization in this task at all. It's just a posture-based mimic task. And as I said, we have a shift in the categorization in the mimic based on the kind of faces that people see. Finally, I'm going to show you that when you think of it, maybe adults are different because we kind of have these special control over our faces, or we want to portray something. So we have children also portraying emotions in intense situations. Jimmy Kimmel is a TV show host who likes to pull pranks on kids, and he uses the parents to do this. So he asks the parents on Halloween, when the kids wake up after they collected candy, tell the kids that you ate up all their Halloween candy. So the kids are waking up in their little pajamas, and then they come up and they see on the kitchen table, they see all these wrappers that the parents put there, empty wrappers. And then the parents say, "I'm sorry, sweetie, but we were hungry last night, and Mommy and Daddy ate up all the candy." And as you can imagine, the kids aren't really very happy about it. So I apologize for the color, but you see here a couple of very strong emotions. You see the sequence of the images of kids really protesting against the nasty parents that have been eating their candy. But actually, this slide is a little bit of a prank itself. And the reason is that the upper category and category and bottom are actually showing different kinds of situations. So yes, these are the kids that their Halloween candy got eaten by the evil parents. But the kids on the top are actually showing extreme happiness. So this girl is actually very happy. She just got the puppy that she was hoping for. This girl over here is extremely happy because she got tickets to Justin Bieber's concert before he went bad. So we see that this really isn't about age per se, although we are now looking at differences in ages across to see when do the expressions become more intense, when do they differentiate, is there a difference between young people and old people. So I know that my time is up, but I did want to get a couple of slides. I think we kind of covered questions of the summary. I'm just going to say that, to be honest, we don't have a good understanding of why positive and negative meet. We are interested in this question, and we're exploring it in various directions. We know that this seems to happen when things are intense. We don't know a lot about natural facial expressions that aren't extremely intense. And my lab is just being built now in Deep, so I'm very anxious to finally get inside there, and hopefully a month or two, or 2, 3, 4 years, who knows how fast things go in Fuji, and start actually doing some more research so we can have some answers to these questions. Thank you very much for your time. Yeah, I know I went over time. If anyone needs to go, please feel free to go. It's no problem. Yeah.
Well, when you show the tennis players, I just thought, okay, every journalist photographer will tell you that they cannot sell crime from London, just a photograph. And they play tricks with that. And then I thought, okay, every artist will tell that the picture of real life is not real life. So what you're studying basically is pictures of facial expression to non-facial expression. So is there any experimental paradigm at all that you can think of when you study real life?
Real life
picture of it.
Right, real life emotion. I would say that it's extremely rare to have these kind of real life interactions in which we extract real life emotions. One degree of separation from that is to extract real life emotions in people by showing them, for example, emotional movies, and have other people rate their facial expressions at the time, even though it's not really an interaction, but it's me looking at your face, watching, for example, a scene from Bambi or the Champ. There are a couple of short clips that we know based on lab research that in about 3 minutes will bring over 60% of the population to tears. It took a lot of time to find these little clips, but once we found them, they're extremely efficient. Noam Sobel, in his science study of the tears, okay, whether if you're familiar or not, he used that to extract, he had to extract tears. So it's like a tear factory. You show the video, and it's, ooh, people are discussing, it's very emotional, and very quickly people connect to the tragedy of what's going on. That's one option. The other option is to have people interact in a real life situation in which one of the people is actually a competitor in the lab. And actually for some emotions, you have to have an interaction. If you want to evoke strong anger, for example, it's not very easy to show a movie that will make you angry. I mean, yeah, sometimes we watch something and we say, oh, that's terrible, but it's not the kind of really gut anger that we usually get. And if you want to evoke anger, you need an interaction. There are all kinds of paradigms of how experimenters can agitate the people that come in to volunteer for the study, and it's actually pretty efficient. Have the person work on a task for 15 minutes, and then come in and accidentally erase all the data. That works really well. And then do it twice, and you have a very angry person. So there are ways to do this, but you can... Yeah, exactly. But you can understand the complexity of these paradigms is so great that the majority of researchers would rather just take a bunch of pictures and, hey, we included, I'm being honest here, and just say, we know here are the faces, let's see what's going on. But I have to admit, what you're saying is a valid comment, and we are striving for that.
Most of this research is basically dealing with ambiguity that maybe just doesn't exist.
I would argue that real life has its own ambiguity, and that we have to use context in real life just as we have to use context over here. I'm arguing it. I'm not showing you data, but I think that many of the phenomena that we see here, we also see in real life interactions. If you look at YouTube clips of people in real life situations, there's lots of ambiguity. You know, click angry road rage or something like that, and you'll see people that are very angry to the degree that they leave their car with a baseball bat to go smash someone's car, and the guy has a dash cam so he can actually see what's going on. Now, if you look at faces alone, it's very hard to know what's going on. So you have to use context also in real life. Maybe in different ways, I don't know. Yeah.
You mentioned intuition several times. I'm not sure that it's intuitively obvious to me that extreme pain and extreme pleasure would look different. That seems to be the result. On the other hand, the intuition that faces deliver more subtle emotions than bodies, that seems so strong an intuitive feeling to me. Why do you figure that the intuition doesn't match the fact? If it got to do perhaps the static pictures rather than video or something like that, what's your feeling? What's your intuition?
My intuition. Well, first of all, as I mentioned before when I was asked about cross-cultural aspects, I don't think this intuition is shared across all people around the globe. I think that in our culture, the idea that faces have these specific, very clear categories of emotion is something that it's deep in our culture. We teach it to our kids. I have books. I remember that I have 3 boys. I remember sitting with them and flipping over pages. לפעמים אני שמח, לפעמים אני עצוב. And I show them why are we teaching children what happy and sad looks like? This is what we do in our culture. This is what Western culture does. Maybe other cultures would have a very different book focusing on very different aspects of what makes people happy or sad. Let's specifically focus on facial expression.
The psychologist Liz Valence.
God forbid. And it won't be the first time. Yeah.
I think my question is a continuation question, and I think I have the answer. So I ask you.
Oh, wonderful.
I think the answer is that we are simplifying in experiments. We always tend to simplify extremes in experiments and classify. And instead of classifying and taking extremes, we should go to the continuous spectrum of facial expression. And when I talk to you, I see your expression from minute to minute. I predict your next words by your expression. And the experiment should be something that takes time, the temporal pattern, into account, and not just go to the extreme point of pleasure or suffering, right? Because, of course, in the extreme pleasure and the extreme pain, we show. It's intuitive to me that you show the same expression. But it's not intuitive that you are, I know that you're smiling now when I ask you the question. I see. And I'm sure you're smiling, and I'm almost sure I would see that you smile if I don't feel your body. So the issue is wider concept of the context.
Okay, well, I'll drink to that, as
Yes.
you say. I think it's a great comment. I think for the sake of the initial argument, it was probably the easiest. And I would argue the correct thing to do, to start with the obvious examples in which we can show that things are kind of look very similar, even with their very opposite poles. Now, what will happen when we look at a more dynamic, temporal, fluid information? Well, it'll be interesting to look at the data. If you look, let's put it this way. The images that we have here aren't a particular frame within, let's say, 500, 600 frames. It's not one particular selected shot that looks very negative. The negativity actually builds up, and it becomes more and more and more negative, and then it goes down, and it becomes kind of more positive. And it's interesting that some later points. That's exactly. But we didn't do that yet. But we're certainly interested in these questions. And I think the additional aspect to what you said is that we can look at, is there some positivity embedded at unusual points throughout this whole spectrum? So, for example, sometimes after the things are very, very negative, it takes some time for people to actually start showing smiles, even though something very, very positive happens. It's negative. You kind of calm down a little bit, and all of a sudden the smiles bloom out of nowhere, it seems. When we have younger children, sometimes we see slightly different patterns in which the initial reaction is, it seems to be prototypically happy. And then after 2-3 seconds, the high intensity kicks in, and it starts going very, very negative. When parents look at this, they think that something went wrong. Parents view this. In fact, you can see by the verbal responses. Are you okay, honey? What's wrong? These are tears of happiness, right? No, the parents aren't sure because it's so convincingly looking negative. So I think the patterns are very, very interesting. And as I said, I will really be happy to look at these patterns. We didn't do this. Yes.
I would suggest something. I have mentioned few children that were born blind. So they weren't exposed neither to smile, not. And it's really difficult for sometimes to know if they are happy or not. The face is half smiling and half not smiling. It's very difficult. Maybe this can give you a clue about what is the basis physiology. Because they didn't learn what they are expected to do, and the continuation is not on the level of what they see, only what they hear or they feel. That might be interesting, yes?
They might have learned, by touching a faces.
I think that, but I remember when they were little children, sometimes I didn't know if they are going to cry now, or they're happy, or what do they express when I'm talking to them, or they're listening in a group. What's going there? It was really interesting, and I didn't study it, and I didn't work about it. It's just something I remember when I was working with a few blind children. And now it jumped out, and I just throw it to you.
Well,
It might be interesting.
It's a great comment, and I think both of you have something in what you mentioned.
They have
because
something to learn, but it's not that like you see 24 hours a day.
Well, there are some studies, not looking perhaps at very extreme situations of emotions, but yet looking at children posing emotions when they're blind. And it depends on what camp you are and how you interpret the data. If you're coming from the basic emotion excellent camp and you say, look, there's above chance categorization, they're succeeding in expressing the emotions even though they're blind and they never saw it before. If you belong to the other camp, you say, yes, but it's so murky, it's really hard to know, it's not much above chance level. When it comes to adults, there's some studies from the Paralympics showing that when people win or lose, they have these portrayals, like people standing up like this. This is from a study looking at the nonverbal expression of pride. Jessica Tracy and David Matsumoto looked at their portrayals, and for example, people standing up and doing this, they do it irrespective of if they're blind or not. But I think this could be something that they learned, and something, perhaps after someone tells you this is what people do, one or two times you start incorporating it into your automatic nonverbal repertoire. So it's hard to know. Okay, I'm really going over time here. I'll be happy to take any questions later.